Gun debate in Virginia continues to heat up.
The governor calling lawmakers back to the Capitol for a special session on the issue after last month's deadly Virginia Beach shooting. But before that debate begins, many lawmakers are hosting roundtable discussions across the Commonwealth.
10 News reporter Lindsay Kennett attended one of those discussions to hear how people feel about what's on the table.
People kill people. Guns don't kill people.
Amen. Second Amendment supporters fired up over proposed gun regulations during a roundtable discussion in Abingdon Tuesday. More than 80 people packed into the Southwest Virginia Higher Education Center, speaking out against the possibility of stricter gun laws.
They are trying to expand the areas that there are no guns allowed, which just means there's going to be more helpless people.
Proposed legislation includes universal background checks, preventing kids from accessing guns until they're 18, and banning silencers and high-capacity ammunition magazines. Plus, a red flag bill that would allow law enforcement to temporarily seize someone's guns if they're a threat to themselves or others.
This is confiscation without representation. What you're proposing, it's not about guns, it's about control.
Virginia Secretary of Public Safety and Homeland Security, Brian Moran, led the discussion. He says the goal of the proposed bills is to protect those most vulnerable to gun violence, like people with mental illnesses, victims of domestic violence, and minorities.
We're not taking law-abiding citizens' guns away. None of these bills do that.
Though not everyone agreed, like retired state police officer Rex Carter, who saw the aftermath of the Virginia Tech shooting.
You're walking through a classroom that's got bullet holes and blood, and you know it's a horrific tragedy. Is limiting a handgun going to stop that? Is limiting a magazine capacity, is that going to stop that?
They did find common ground over addressing suicide, drug addiction, and mental illness. But it's unclear if the Republican-held General Assembly can compromise during the special legislative session on July 9th. In Abingdon, Lindsay Kennett, 10 News, working for you.